There's a very short list of television shows that didn't just entertain people, they actually changed the way people felt about the world. Shows that didn't just make you laugh, but made you stop and think. Made you cry without warning. Made you question things you thought you already understood. MASH is on that list. In fact, for a lot of people, it sits right at the very top. For 11 seasons, from 1972 to 1983, MASH was one of the most watched programs on American television. It pulled off something that almost no show before or since has managed to do. It was simultaneously a comedy and a tragedy, a war story and a love story, a workplace sitcom and a meditation on what it means to stay human in the middle of chaos. It made you laugh out loud one minute and then feel a weight on your chest the next. That combination was rare, and audiences couldn't get enough of it. But here's the thing about a show that runs for 11 years, a lot can change. Characters evolve. Writers take the story in new directions. The tone shifts. And the people sitting in those chairs? The actors bringing these characters to life week after week? They change too. They grow restless. They get tired. They start to feel like the show is moving on without them, or they feel the pull of something new. And sometimes, after seasons of laughs and hard work and long hours on set, they make the difficult decision to walk away. That's what this video is about. The real, full story of why some of the most beloved actors in MASH history decided to leave, and what happened to them when they did. Some of these exits were dramatic. Some were quiet. Some were heartbreaking. And a few of them actually changed the show forever in ways nobody expected. So let's get into it. Before we start talking about departures, it helps to understand just how unique the world of MASH was, and why leaving it was never a simple decision. The show was born from a 1968 novel by a Korean War surgeon who wrote under the pen name Richard Hooker. That book captured something raw and honest about what it felt like to be a doctor stationed in a mobile army surgical hospital during wartime, the absurdity of it, the horror of it, the dark humor that soldiers and medics develop just to stay sane. Director Robert Altman turned it into a celebrated film in 1970, and 2 years later, CBS brought the story to the small screen. What the television version did differently was slow down. Instead of a 2-hour film, it had seasons to develop its characters, to give them backstories and contradictions and moments of genuine growth. And the timing couldn't have been more significant. The show debuted while the Vietnam War was still raging, while American families were watching the news every night and seeing footage they wished they could unsee. MASH, set during the Korean War, was really talking about all of that. It was a funhouse mirror held up to a nation that was exhausted and grieving. The cast was remarkable from the very beginning. Alan Alda stepped into the role of Hawkeye Pierce and immediately became the soul of the show, a brilliant surgeon, a sharp wit, and a deeply moral man who used humor as both a weapon and a shield. Around him, a rotating ensemble of characters filled in the picture. Some were heroes. Some were villains. Some were comic relief. And all of them, in one way or another, eventually had to reckon with the question of whether they were willing to stay. Because MASH wasn't easy. The long production schedule was demanding. The emotional weight of the material was heavy. And as the show grew more ambitious, moving further away from simple jokes and toward complex, sometimes devastating storytelling, not everyone was comfortable with where it was going. The first major departure from MASH is also, arguably, the most famous exit in television history. Not just because of how it was handled, but because of what came after. McLean Stevenson played Colonel Henry Blake, the bumbling but lovable commanding officer of the 4077th. Henry was the kind of authority figure you couldn't help but root for, genuinely well-meaning, perpetually frazzled, and completely out of his depth in ways that were somehow endearing rather than frustrating. He wasn't a bad officer because he was cruel or corrupt. He was a bad officer because he was just too decent and too human to operate like a machine. Audiences adored him for exactly that reason. Stevenson earned real critical recognition for the role, including a Golden Globe. And for a while, life on set was good. But underneath the surface, something was shifting. As the show progressed through its early seasons, the creative center of gravity started to move. Alan Alda was not only starring in MASH, he was increasingly writing episodes, directing them, and shaping the overall direction of the series. His character, Hawkeye, was becoming more than just a lead. He was becoming the show's moral compass, the figure through whom every major theme was filtered. That's a massive amount of creative real estate, and the more of it Hawkeye occupied, the less was available for everyone else. McLean started to feel the squeeze. In interviews from that era, he was remarkably candid about it. He told People magazine in 1975 that he wanted to be number one. He wanted to carry a show, not support one. And while that might sound like simple ego, it was actually something more complicated and more understandable than that. He was a talented man who had big dreams, and he could see that those dreams weren't going to come true if he stayed where he was. He believed he had what it took to be a star in his own right, and he was running out of patience waiting for MASH to give him that chance. So at the end of season 3, he went to the producers and told them he was done. And that's when the show's creators made a decision that nobody who watched that era of television will ever forget. They killed him. Not metaphorically. Not off-screen in some vague, hand-wavy way. They wrote Henry Blake's plane getting shot down over the Sea of Japan, with no survivors. They did it without warning, without fanfare, and without giving more than a handful of people on the cast a heads up. The scene that delivered this news was simple: Radar walking into the operating room, hat in hand, face pale, reciting a military report in a quiet, broken voice, but the impact was seismic. The actors not told in advance were reacting in real time, and it showed. The grief on their faces was genuine, because in some ways, it was. CBS received an avalanche of letters after the episode aired. People were stunned, angry, devastated. A beloved character had been ripped away with no warning, and the show wasn't apologizing for it. Co-creator Larry Gelbart later said they did it because they wanted to remind viewers that this was a show about war, and in war, not everyone gets to go home. It was a statement of artistic intention, and it worked on every level. As for McLean Stevenson himself, things didn't go the way he hoped. He signed a deal with NBC and launched his own sitcom, but it was cancelled after one season. A second attempt fared even worse. Looking back years later, he acknowledged that walking away from MASH had been a mistake. He called it taking himself out of the game, and you can hear the weight of that realization in the way he said it. He kept working in television until his death in 1996 at 68, but he never found a role that connected with audiences the way Henry Blake did. And the cruel irony is that his departure, the very act meant to free him, gave MASH one of its defining moments. Henry Blake's death made the show something more than entertainment. It made it literature. If McLean Stevenson left with a bang, Wayne Rogers left with barely a whisper. And in some ways, his story is even stranger. Wayne played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's best friend and partner in Mischief. Together, the two of them were the engine of early MASH, quick, irreverent, always scheming, always pushing back against the military bureaucracy and the senselessness of the war around them. Their banter was electric. Their friendship felt real. A lot of viewers tuned in specifically to watch these two volley jokes and wisdom back and forth in the shadow of something terrible. Wayne was not a passive presence. He was smart, he'd studied history at Princeton, which tells you something about the depth he brought to the role, and he cared deeply about the craft of acting. When he signed on to MASH, his understanding was that the show would be a true ensemble. Everyone would share the spotlight. The load would be distributed. That's not what happened. As seasons passed and Alan Alda's creative footprint expanded, Trapper John began to shrink. He went from co-lead to supporting character, from equal partner to the guy nodding along while Hawkeye delivered the important speeches. Wayne described it in later interviews with a kind of wry clarity. Trapper had gone from being one half of the dynamic duo to being the guy who nodded at everything Alan said. He wasn't angry about it in a bitter way. He was just honest about it, and about the fact that it no longer made sense for him to stay. What makes his exit especially fascinating is the legal dimension. It turned out that Wayne Rogers had never actually signed a formal contract with the show. He had been operating on a handshake deal the entire time. When producers threatened legal action after he announced he wouldn't return, they discovered they had no case. He had broken no contract, because no written contract existed. He simply didn't come back, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The writers scrambled. Season 4 had to open with an explanation that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye was away on leave, a thin justification for a sudden absence that a lot of viewers didn't buy. There was no farewell party, no final monologue, no tearful goodbye. One episode he was there, and then he just wasn't anymore. In Trapper's place came BJ Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell. BJ was a different kind of character entirely, more emotionally open, more conflicted, with a wife and daughter back home who gave his wartime experience a particular kind of poignancy. The show's tone shifted. The buddy comedy edge softened. And MASH, to the surprise of many, got better. Not that Trapper wasn't wonderful, but his absence created a space that the show filled with something deeper. After leaving, Wayne pivoted in a direction that surprised almost everyone. He moved into finance, built a career as an investor, and eventually became a regular commentator on Fox News discussing economics. By most accounts, he made more money on Wall Street than he ever did on television. He remained on good terms with his former castmates. Alan Alda once described him as one of the smartest people he'd ever worked with. When Wayne died in 2015 at 82, Alda mourned him publicly and warmly. Wayne Rogers never seemed to regret leaving MASH. He found his own version of success, even if it looked nothing like the version he'd originally imagined. And Trapper John, for all his abrupt disappearance, remains one of the most fondly remembered characters in the series, proof that sometimes the most impactful exits are the ones with no goodbye at all. Here is where the story gets quieter, sadder, and more human than anything else we've talked about. Gary Burghoff played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly, the unit's baby-faced company clerk who seemed to have a sixth sense about everything. He could hear incoming helicopters before anyone else in camp. He had an almost supernatural awareness of what was happening around him, paired with a gentle, childlike sweetness that made him feel out of place in a war zone in the most heartbreaking possible way. He carried a teddy bear. He wrote letters home to his mother. He was, in every sense of the word, innocent, and watching war chip away at that innocence was one of the emotional through lines of the entire series. Gary was the only cast member who had played the character before. He'd appeared as Radar in Robert Altman's 1970 film, and when the TV series launched, he brought everything he'd already developed in the role and layered it deeper. The TV version of Radar was warmer and more vulnerable than the film version, less a gag and more a soul. Gary shaped that transformation himself, and it was one of the most quietly brilliant pieces of character work in the history of American television. For seasons, he held the whole thing together. But behind the warmth and the big eyes and the nervous laugh, something else was building. Gary struggled throughout his time on MASH in ways that rarely made headlines but were very real. He dealt with anxiety and depression, conditions that carried significant stigma at the time and that were simply not discussed the way they might be today. The production schedule was relentless, and his perfectionism made it harder on him than it might have been on someone with a different temperament. He wanted every scene to be right. He cared deeply, and that caring had a cost. The thing that wore on him most, though, was time. By the late 1970s, Gary had a family, a wife and a young daughter, and the demands of MASH meant he was constantly away from them. He later said that missing his daughter's early years was a mistake he never stopped regretting. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of regret that follows a person. His relationship with the producers became strained as well. He wanted better pay, more flexibility in his schedule, and fewer episodes per season so he could manage his personal life. The producers, knowing how central Radar was to the show's identity, tried to work with him. For a while, he was given lighter seasonal commitments, a reduced schedule. But the emotional exhaustion ran too deep. By season 8, he was done. Unlike Wayne Rogers, though, Gary didn't slip away unacknowledged. The writers gave Radar a proper farewell, a two-part episode called Goodbye, Radar, that stands as one of the most emotionally resonant hours in the show's history. In it, Radar returns from leave to find the 4077th falling apart, spends one last stretch trying to fix everything the way he always has, and finally accepts that it's time to go home. His mother needs him. His community needs him. And perhaps, after everything he's seen, Radar himself needs something that this war zone simply cannot give him. The closing image, Radar walking away across the Korean landscape, silhouetted against the sky, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, said everything without saying a word. There wasn't a dry eye watching it, and there wasn't supposed to be. After MASH, Gary stepped back from the spotlight almost entirely. He made a few appearances, including a short-lived spin-off that didn't find an audience, but mostly he retreated. He took up painting. He threw himself into wildlife conservation. He became an inventor, actually holding patents for products he developed himself, including a fishing tackle system. Those things, the nature and the quiet and the creating, became his way of healing. He's still alive today, living privately, rarely doing interviews. Every now and then a fan will spot him at a convention or catch a quote from him in some publication, and the affection that rushes back is immediate. Because Radar was never just a character. He was the conscience of a show that desperately needed one, and Gary Burghoff gave him a life that mattered. There's a particular kind of challenge that comes with playing a character audiences love to hate. You have to be convincing enough that the hatred feels real, but restrained enough that you don't tip over into something unwatchable. Larry Linville spent 5 seasons threading that needle as Major Frank Burns, and he did it brilliantly, so brilliantly, in fact, that it eventually became a prison. Frank Burns was the show's antagonist in the truest sense. He was petty, hypocritical, self-righteous, and deeply insecure, a man who hid all of his weaknesses behind a rigid commitment to rules and rank. He was conducting a secret affair with Major Houlihan while simultaneously positioning himself as a model of military virtue. He was the perfect foil to Hawkeye and Trapper because his pomposity gave them something to deflate, and there was always more of it to go around. Larry Linville played all of this with a precision that was almost meticulous. He understood exactly how much to lean into Frank's awfulness at any given moment, when to make him ridiculous and when to make him genuinely unpleasant, when the comedy should make you laugh and when it should make you uncomfortable. He was a far more skilled actor than the role required, and for 5 seasons, he applied that skill entirely in service of a character with almost no room to grow. That was the problem. As MASH evolved, it started asking deeper questions of its characters. It started exploring moral ambiguity in ways that required nuance. The other characters on the show were changing, finding new dimensions, confronting new truths. But Frank couldn't change. He was locked. His function in the story depended on him remaining exactly as he was, and that limitation was becoming visible in ways it hadn't been before. By the end of season 5, Larry made a decision that was, in its own way, just as principled as any artistic stance a person can take. He walked away. Not because he was pushed, not because of a contract dispute, but because he recognized that he had done everything he could do with the character. He later said he had taken Frank Burns as far as that character could go. Staying would have meant repeating himself indefinitely, and he wasn't willing to do that. The show handled his exit quietly, writing Frank off-screen as having received a promotion, a very Frank Burns kind of ending, actually, kicking upstairs a man who was always more comfortable with titles than with competence. And with that, the slot was open for something new. What came in to fill it was David Ogden Stiers as Charles Emerson Winchester III, and we'll get to him in just a moment. But first, it's worth sitting with what Larry Linville's departure meant. For 5 seasons, Frank had served as the lightning rod for everything absurd and infuriating about military culture. His exit meant the show had to find a new way to generate dramatic tension, and the path it chose was smarter and more sophisticated. The comedy became less about a villain to mock and more about the moral contradictions inherent in war itself. That shift wouldn't have been possible if Larry hadn't been willing to leave. After MASH, he worked steadily in television and film but never found a role with the same cultural footprint. Frank Burns was the role of his career, which is a strange and slightly melancholy thing to say about a character who was so thoroughly unlikable. But the best television villains have always been the ones you can't quite look away from, and Frank was exactly that. If McLean Stevenson's departure gave MASH its most shocking moment, and Wayne Rogers' absence gave it room to breathe, and Gary Burghoff's farewell gave it one of its most beautiful episodes, then David Ogden Stiers' presence gave it something equally important, the dignity of a full arc, seen through to completion. Stiers joined the cast in season 6 as Charles Emerson Winchester III, a character conceived as a replacement for Frank Burns but who quickly became something entirely his own. Where Frank was petty and small, Charles was grand and composed. He was a brilliant surgeon from a wealthy Boston family, cultured in ways the rest of the camp was not, deeply devoted to classical music and fine wine and everything that distinguished him from what he considered lesser minds. He was insufferable, and he was magnificent. But Stiers understood something crucial about Charles from the very beginning, that all of that posturing was armor. It was protection. Beneath the references to Mozart and the withering condescension was a man who felt things as deeply as anyone at the 4077th, maybe more deeply, because he had more to lose. His pride and his refinement were the things he was most afraid of war stripping away, and the show, over seasons, did exactly that. It stripped them away, one devastating scene at a time, and what it found underneath was heartbreaking and genuine. Stiers played all of it with extraordinary control. He knew how to be comic without being cartoonish, and how to turn, within a single scene, from pompous to vulnerable in a way that felt completely earned. Some of his quieter moments, a look held a beat too long, a silence where there might have been a retort, were among the finest acting in the series. Unlike several of his co-stars, Stiers never had serious conflicts with the show or its direction. He stayed through to the final episode, which aired in 1983 and became the most-watched television program in American history at the time. His final scene in that finale, teaching a group of Chinese prisoners of war to play Mozart on a collection of instruments, sitting with them in the wreckage of a war neither side fully chose, is one of those moments in television that is simply beyond description. It was quiet and transcendent and devastating all at once. When the opportunity to appear in the Aftermath spin-off came along, Stiers declined. He said that Winchester's arc was finished, that the character had said what he needed to say. That kind of artistic integrity, knowing when a story is done, is rarer than it sounds. Stiers went on to do voice work for Disney, among many other projects, and remained an active and respected figure in the industry. In 2009, in an interview, he came out as gay, something he had kept private for decades out of concern that it might affect his career, particularly his work with family-oriented studios. He spoke about it with the quiet dignity that characterized everything he did. He passed away in 2018 at age 75, mourned deeply by the MASH community and the broader world of American entertainment. His legacy in the show is not the departure of a character but the completion of one. And in a series full of goodbyes, that completeness stands out. In a show full of remarkable performances, one of the most quietly revolutionary arcs belongs to someone who never left, and whose decision to stay might have been just as meaningful as any of the departures we've discussed. Loretta Swit played Major Margaret Houlihan, who begins the series saddled with a nickname, Hot Lips, that was inherited from the original film and that tells you everything about how the character was initially conceived. She was the punchline. She was the straight-laced rule follower who gave the rebels something to push against. She was, in the show's early DNA, more archetype than person. Swit refused to accept that. Quietly, persistently, over the course of 11 seasons, she worked to make Margaret real. She pushed for her character to be given more emotional depth, more professional credibility, more of the complexity that the male characters were allowed as a matter of course. She didn't grandstand about it. She just kept doing the work, kept finding the human moments in her character, kept insisting with her performance that this woman deserved to be taken seriously. And eventually, the show caught up. By the later seasons, Margaret Houlihan was no longer a punchline. She was one of the most fully drawn characters on the canvas. She was a decorated officer and a gifted head nurse who did her job with absolute precision even as the war made that job nearly unbearable. She was someone who questioned the cruelty around her while still showing up every single day. She fell in love and had her heart broken and came out the other side with more clarity about who she was. She grew. Swit stayed for all 11 seasons, one of only 4 actors to appear in both the pilot and the finale. While other characters, many of them women, came and went in smaller roles, Margaret endured. And in enduring, she changed what the show was capable of saying. She later spoke about her intention with the character in terms that were simple and direct. She wanted Margaret to be a woman of substance. She succeeded, completely, and in doing so, she gave MASH one of its great arguments against the idea that war is only a man's story. It would be easy to look at all of these departures, and this one notable decision to stay, and see them simply as Hollywood drama. Actors getting restless. Contract disputes. Egos clashing. The kind of behind-the-scenes turbulence that is as old as the entertainment industry itself. But that's not really what's happening here. What these stories are actually about is something much more fundamental, people trying to figure out who they are and what they owe to the work they're part of. McLean Stevenson wanted to be more than a supporting player. That's not vanity, that's ambition, a very human thing. He made a choice that didn't pan out the way he hoped, and he was honest about that regret. But in making that choice, he inadvertently gave MASH one of its most important and most talked about moments. Wayne Rogers recognized that the role he was playing had stopped growing and made a clean, unsentimental break. He moved on to build a completely different kind of life, and he seems to have found satisfaction in it. His exit left a gap that the show filled in surprising ways. Gary Burghoff stayed as long as he could, and when he left because staying was costing him things he couldn't afford to keep paying. Family. Health. Peace of mind. His departure was honored with an episode that stands as one of the show's finest hours, and his retreat from public life afterward reads not as a failure but as a man finally taking care of himself. Larry Linville walked away from a role he was exceptional at because he was honest enough to admit he had reached its limits. That kind of self-awareness is uncommon and worth honoring. David Ogden Stiers stayed and saw the whole thing through to its conclusion, and his reward was one of the most beautiful final moments any character in television history has ever been given. And Loretta Swit never left, never stopped fighting for her character's dignity, and walked away 11 years later having changed what a woman on a war-set sitcom could be. These are not just stories about a television show. They're stories about people navigating the tension between personal ambition and communal work, between what we want for ourselves and what we owe to something bigger than us. MASH asked those questions of its characters every week, in the context of a war that had no good answers. And it turns out the people who made the show were wrestling with the same questions off-screen. That's what makes MASH worth talking about 40+ years after it ended. The stories don't stop being interesting. They don't stop being human. And neither do the people who lived them. Thanks for watching. If you want to dig deeper into the history of classic television, hit subscribe, ring that bell, and let us know in the comments which MASH character or storyline you'd most like us to cover next.